So we have a brand new trial. It is the Adelson's matriarch murder trial. Now, if you aren't aware what the case is all about, I am going to give you a quick recap. However, I do want to say major trigger warning. Let's get into it. This is Donna Adelson. No, I apologize. My bad. I apologize about that mix up. However, let's talk about this little diagram because multiple people, I believe it's 5 people total so far, have been prosecuted for Dan Markel's death. Dan Markel married Wendy and they ended up getting divorced. And if you've read Dan Markel's mom's book, and also I believe 2020 has an episode on it, their marriage was kind of horrible because of Wendy and her family. You see, he was Jewish and he wanted to ensure that his children were instilled with those beliefs. Wendy and her family literally did not care, which is interesting because they were Jewish as well, but apparently they were not practicing Jewish. They end up getting divorced and it's a tumultuous divorce. Why? Because Wendy's entire family is up in Miami. Dan Markel is an attorney and a professor at FSU in Tallahassee. So Donna Adelson, and they have the emails, is like harboring Wendy, you need to tell your attorney, you guys need to move up here. You know, it's important, act like it. You know, just telling her, look, you need to get your attorney to fight this judge and get Dan to sign off on you moving to Miami with the kids. And of course, Dan Markel was like, absolutely not. That is not happening. These are my kids. Why would I want them away from me? And the judge agreed, which of course did not make Wendy's family excited about that. They were all in Miami. So fast forward, Dan Markel one day is, offered $1 million from Wendy's family to move to Miami. They were like, we'll pay you $1 million. Please move to Miami. That way we can all be here and you can start your career over. He said, no, absolutely not doing it. Now, mind you, Wendy is an attorney as well. However, I believe that when they got married, his career exploded versus hers. She was a stay-at-home mom. She started doing, different things. Didn't explode as much, so she was able to, if she wanted to, pick up and move to Miami. So anyways, one day he goes to the gym. He, after denying Wendy's family, I'm not moving to Miami, he goes to the gym, comes home, and is essentially gunned down in his home. Okay. The police are called, of course, and it starts breaking down really quickly because the neighbors saw a Prius. And when they start investigating, that's where they find these two right here, the friends. And it's Tuto, and I can't remember what the other guy's called. They, by the way, testified against Charlie Adelson, which is the brother of Wendy, who was found guilty and is sentenced to 30 years. According to the previous trial, Charlie was dating Katie, and Charlie was like, apparently due to his mom talking in his ear, was like, we've got to solve this. We've got to get rid of Dan so that my sister and the kids can move to Miami. And he talks to Katie, allegedly. Well, not allegedly because they're all in jail and she confessed to it. And she tells her baby dad, which is insane, who apparently was part of a gang or knew people in a gang. So it was the baby father and the gang guy. They drive down to Tallahassee and they gun down Dan. However, they had him on camera, in the, I think it was like at the ATM or whatever. I don't even remember where they had him on camera. They end up getting arrested and prosecuted, and that's when they started figuring out these connections. And the prosecution started over years. Keep in mind, it's been years since they've been kind of getting everyone. Katie confessed to it after she went to trial and said that she was not guilty. She didn't know anything, and breaks down the fact that they put her on Charlie Adelson's payroll. So Charlie Adelson is a dentist, or was a dentist, who was extremely wealthy and had her on his payroll, but she didn't work there. So apparently that's how he paid off everyone that did this. Now, why is Donna being prosecuted? Well, they're stating that Donna was the one that essentially created all of this. How? Because they said there was a bump. A bump is essentially when an FBI agent goes up to Donna and is like, hey, I heard that you're taking care of so-and-so in jail. You need to take care of me too, like my people or whatever. And instead of her being like, why is this person trying to get money out of me? I didn't have anything to do with Dan's death. She calls Charlie. And they have conversations, and that's when they overhear him in a restaurant, pretty much like, they don't have anything on us, we're good, yada yada. And they go over all of that in Dan Markel's the other series that I have where Charlie was found guilty. When Charlie is found guilty, Donna here, they have jail conversations where she's telling Charlie, I am going to go ahead. I'm getting everything in order to put everything in a trust, and we're looking to leave to a place that doesn't have extradition. This is on a jail call. So while they were still investigating her, they weren't going to move as quickly until she started talking about we're going to Vietnam. And so then they were arrested at the airport when they were going to Vietnam. It was a one-way ticket. They found emails where she was asking a travel agent how to end up getting visas so they could stay there, and the fact that you could not extradite from Vietnam. Wendy, you must be asking yourself, what the hell is Wendy not arrested? We all want to know. However, what we understand is that Wendy got derivative immunity. Derivative immunity is that you provide the police with as much information as you possibly can. However, if they find evidence on their own that didn't come from you, where shows that you have culpability, that derivative immunity is completely gone and dropped, and she can be prosecuted. They have stated that she did hire one of the top derivative immunity attorneys in the country, because right now she hasn't been prosecuted. And well, Donna's trial started today. Donna has maintained that she is not guilty. She had nothing to do with this. They've all said that this was a thing from the gang. I can't even think of the gang name, but let me tell you this. The guy that's in the gang, and I apologize, it was Latin something. I apologize, I don't remember the gang. He was livid, and that's one of the reasons why he testified against Charlie, because he's like, the gang had nothing to do with this. I don't want the gang mentioned. I did this on my own. This is what we were told to do. Y'all need to stop mentioning this gang. And apparently that gang, and it's Latino, oh my God, I apologize, I can't remember the name, Latin Kings maybe, have him threatened, and Charlie Adelson has had to move prisons. So opening statements started today. My next video will have opening statements for you guys. I know that's a lot of information. Hopefully this diagram helped. Talk to you soon. If you want to follow the trial without watching the 7 hours that they're going to have every day, follow me. All right, guys, this is day 1 of the Adelson matriarch murder trial. So let's get into opening statement. This is the prosecutor who did the opening statement, Sarah Catherine Dugan, I believe is her name. And Sarah shares that Donna Adelson is there because she was part of a conspiracy to hire a hitman to take the life of her former son-in-law, Dan Markel, back in 2014. She shares that the defendant's family had a big problem, and that big problem was Dan Markel. And the solution was that her son, Charlie Adelson, who is facing, or he's currently in jail with 30-year sentence, he was a prominent dentist, okay? And he was essentially a mama's boy. And well, they said, look, he was dating a girl, had a girlfriend that had connections to the type of people who were willing and capable of pointing a gun to a complete stranger and pulling the trigger. She then goes on to talk a little bit more about Dan Markel so that the jury can essentially, connect with him. Dan Markel was a respected law professor at Florida State University, College of Law. He also was a loving father to 2 little boys. He was highly respected. I know that during their marriage, he actually traveled a lot to speak at different conferences. She shares that the last day of his life, it began like any other day. He woke up, he took his 2 young sons to preschool, went to the gym to work out, and mind you, they're showing pictures during that time. And when he finished his workout, he returns home, he pulls into his driveway, opens his garage, and someone immediately goes up to his vehicle and fires into his car. She says that he did not know clearly throughout his entire routine that morning that someone had hired 2 hitmen to travel all the way to Tallahassee from Miami, where their entire family lives, for the sole purpose of taking his life, okay? Now, Dan Markel's neighbor actually was the one that heard the gunshot, and he looked out the window and immediately saw a light-colored Toyota Prius quickly leave out of the driveway and speed away. So the neighbor states that when he sees them speed away, he was like, okay, what's going on? So he thought maybe Dan would be the next one to reverse out the driveway. When he sees that Dan didn't reverse, he decides to go to Dan's house to look in the car, make sure everything's okay. That is when he finds a gruesome scene. The driver's side window is shattered. The glasses and the wallet or the phone belonging to Dan Markel is laying on the floor next to the vehicle. He is unresponsive, and at this point, the neighbor calls 911. When law enforcement arrives, they discover that he has a gunshot wound to the head. He was taken to the hospital and he survived about 14 hours before he was pronounced dead. He died at just 41 years of age. Now, when police start investigating, they notice that there's nothing left. So there's no real crime scene evidence. There's no DNA, no bullet casing, no fingerprints. And that's when they're like, hold up a minute. This must have been a professional hitman. Now, the evidence that they have sends them down two different paths. One, they start looking into who would hate Dan Markel enough to hire someone to take his life. But then also they start going down his personal life. And that is when they realize that he was in the middle of a very nasty divorce with his ex-wife, who is her daughter, Wendy Adelson. Keep in mind, Wendy Adelson is also an attorney, not as successful as him. And also she has derivative immunity. I go into that in the previous video. As they start looking at the divorce case file, they realize that Wendy had petitioned the courts to allow her to move with her two boys to Miami because that is where her family is and she wants to have them over there. As you can imagine, Dan Markel is extremely opposed to this. Specifically, he states that he works in Tallahassee. He's a law professor there. That is where he lives. He wants his kids to be raised. And he, of course, wanted to keep his children close to him. Now, they also start going through Wendy's emails, and as they do, they realize that, well, Donna Adelson here was the driving force behind her daughter moving to Miami. She specifically states, the prosecutor specifically states this. She says, you know, it's normal for a parent to be caring and involved, but at this point, she was extremely controlling. She had very strong opinions about all the decisions Wendy made, whether it be her career, her relationships, or even purchasing a home. If Wendy Adelson would not do as the defendant wanted her to do, then she would reach out to Charlie, that's the one that's, you know, in prison, and have Charlie reach out to solve the problem and get Wendy to essentially support what Donna Adelson, their mother, wanted. Now, she does add, look, Wendy did want to move to Miami. However, in the emails, it shows how desperate Donna was for her to move to Miami and to essentially take the kids away from Dan Markel. The defendant specifically tells Wendy, her daughter, that she deserved more than just a life teaching in Tallahassee without her family, and that Dan Markel was essentially holding her hostage in Tallahassee because of his job. In fact, there was emails shown where she pretty much told her, you need to argue with the attorney. You need to tell him this. The attorney needs to understand why you need to move to Miami. The prosecutor even goes so far to state that in the emails, Donna Adelson would actually guilt trip her daughter and literally stating to her how much time she and her husband were having to spend away from their dental practice. This family is very wealthy. They had a huge dental practice as well as their son. She states that they had to take away and make less money because they're having to visit Wendy and the grandchildren in Tallahassee. They were losing income and losing patients because of the constant absences from the practice. She said, you know, your priority in getting this divorce is to ensure that you move here. This is a non-negotiable. Now, in June of 2013, that judge actually sided with Dan Markel and denied her ability to relocate and dismissed it in a way that prevented Wendy Adelson from actually requesting the relocation again. She would not be permitted to move to Miami and take the kids with her at that time or ever, unless she came on, to an agreement alone with Dan Markel. No judges, no courts could be involved. Now, at this point, Donna Adelson has emails where she's talking about that the Dan Markel had not beaten the Adelson family yet. He doesn't know the Adelson family and that they're going to win. She even tells her to bribe Dan Markel and that they would each pay Dan $333,000 to match $1 million just to offer him to be okay with him leaving his job in Tallahassee, relocating so that way he could continue his career in Miami and not essentially suffer financially. I want to share that this is a long opening statement, so I'm going to go into a part 2. But what was interesting about all of this is the fact that they tried to bully him. In fact, Donna Adelson told her daughter, if we can't bribe him, we're going to make him miserable and we are going to bully him into doing what we want him to do. The next witness is Joanne Maltese. She is actually retired, but at the time she was a forensic specialist, and she did it for about 15 years. So she shares that on that particular day, her job was to arrive and collect evidence at the crime scene. So they look at multiple things. One of the things that they did collect was his eyeglasses. Keep in mind that the previous witness stated that the eyeglasses were shattered. Half were on the floor of the car. The other half were on his lap. She then shares that they swabbed or attempted to get fingerprints from the scene. They processed the entire exterior of the vehicle for fingerprints. There was an area that was lifted, but it didn't have fingerprints or any value to compare. They swabbed all the exterior and interior door handles, as well as the phone that was collected. They swabbed the doorknob from the garage to the interior of the house. They said that they sent to the lab all of those items for analysis. Nothing was of value. They were unable to get any type of fingerprints. The next item they go over is a wallet that belonged to Dan Markel, had his driver's license, no cash. They asked them, was there any evidence that the house was broken into or anything was taken from the house? She said not that she could determine. They did state that looking at the front driver's window, it was shattered with a hole in it. The glass was very fragile. It was broken, but prior to doing anything and to taking any type of fingerprint, they had to put clear tape on both sides just to hold it in place for transportation and for collecting. So they did go over the glass that was collected at the scene. They then start talking about Wendy Adelson's car, her daughter, and the fact that they also went through the vehicle. She shares that it was photographed at the Tallahassee Police Department, and they asked her, what did you find in the vehicle? And she said, well, in the passenger seat, they found a bottle of alcohol and a receipt. So when they looked at the receipt, they saw that it was from the same day, July 18th of 2014 at 12:49. And it was from ABC Fine Liquor, Spirits, or Fine Wine, etc. They asked her, did you also go to the hospital? He goes, yes, we documented and collected any evidence. At the time that we went to the hospital, Mr. Markel was still alive. So they go over those photographs and publish them as well. And let's get into the next witness. This is Dr. Clark, Anthony Clark, and he shares that he is an associate medical examiner at the GBI, which is the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. So they share that he is an associate medical examiner. He performs the autopsies and autoforensic autopsies and death investigations. He worked in Tallahassee as an assistant medical examiner back from 2007 to 2023. They also kind of go over his history just to show that he, in fact, was considered an expert. He actually performed the autopsy on Dan Markel the following day at 11:55 a.m. He also shares that as part of the examination, they look into the gunshot wounds. They want to know whether the bullets are still in the body or how big they are, and if they've been broken up, if they are still in the body. So at that point, they do x-rays, and they showed the x-rays and kind of went over them. They said the bullets were recovered from Dan Markel. They did come out because they were very dense. He goes, the x-rays bounce off and turn them white because they're just like bone. So there were 2 bullets in Dan Markel's head. So they go over all of the evidence, the different wounds that he had. I'm not going to go into that, but they did state that the presence of the evidence does suggest that the muzzle of the gun was quite close to Dan Markel's head when it was fired. He thinks just inches away from his head. They then ask him, do you have an opinion on how, the shots were fired? Like which one went first, second? He said, yes, after discussing with the investigators and looking at the scene photographs, the first shots went through the closed car window. So the first shot would have been the left cheek area. And then he says the second one at this point was after the glass shattered and it struck the skin pretty quickly. Now, he did confirm that the second shot was in fact the one that was not survivable. So they said, was there any amount of medical attention that could have saved his life? He goes, well, they're pretty devastating injuries, particularly the one that went to the brain. So it would have been almost impossible for him to survive those injuries. At this point, the jury goes on a break and they start discussing evidence that the defense team does not want shown or demonstrated. It was an email from March of 2011. Keep in mind, Danny was not murdered until 2014, so they were still together. And it's essentially a content of a paragraph where there's a discussion where Donna Adelson is not happy that Dan and his parents are attempting to spend time with the kids. And, the whole point is that they're saying, look, there's grounds showing not only did her hatred for Dan affect the relationship, but it extended all the way to the parents. The defense is stating, look, yes, that email exists and it was a derogatory comment that she made towards Danny's parents, not Dan directly. So at this point, this has nothing to do with this. It's not relevant to the case and they were still married. Georgia Kaplan responds and says it 100% is relevant because it goes towards a motive. She did not want these children not only to be with the father, but also with the father's family. She wanted them with her and her family. That's exactly what happened. So at this point, the judge agrees with Georgia Kaplan and says, it does show the animosity. It does have motive, kind of grounds behind it. And that's what she says. Look, if you look at the email the defense team shares, Mrs. Adelson is complaining that Wendy and Danny have to shuttle the boys down to see his parents instead of the parents driving up to see the boys. It has nothing to do with the fact that they're trying to keep them from the family. It's just the fact that they have to drive instead of the parents coming to see the children. Georgia responds and says, look, this evidence has everything to do with this because it shows that there was animosity going back all the way to 2011 and the fact that everything in relation to Dan Markel needed to be erased. And we know for a fact that when Dan Markel died, Wendy moved to Miami within 48 hours. Wendy kept the children from his family. Not only that, she changed the last name from Markel to Adelson. They then go through another email, which is apparently from Wendy's Match.com, just kind of showing how Donna was so controlling. And even in her relationships with other people, she had to have a say. Then they go in another email where it shows that Wendy moved from a residence, showing that she was in a secure location to a less secure location. And keep in mind that the reason they're bringing that up is because Wendy stated that she moved to Miami because she was in fear for her life. First and foremost, Dan Markel and his entire family, they are devoutly Jewish. And well, they were Jewish too, except that they didn't practice. And mind you, they didn't figure out that they did not practice until the wedding, which I'm not going to go into those details. Needless to say, the rabbis had nothing to eat, even though Dan Markel's family had made it clear that they needed to ensure that the meals were kosher. Anywho, fast forward, again, they are devout Jewish, and the first idea was that Wendy would take her children and pose for pictures in front of a Catholic church, then post on social media to announce that she was getting the children baptized in that church. That way, it appears to Dan Markel that they were changing their religion. Keep in mind, this was all an act. And again, she put this all in emails. We know it's on an act. We just want to get him to let you move to Miami. But she literally told Wendy Adelson in her emails, in order to pull off the stunt, she had to put on the acting performance of her life. She told her it did not matter what she had to do. If she needed to dress up her two little toddlers up in Nazi uniforms, she needed to do that as long as she could get Dan Markel to agree to have those children living in South Florida. Again, this is all available in the emails between each other. She goes on to tell Wendy that the rest of their lives as grandparents and Charlie's as an uncle depended on Wendy Adelson getting the boys approved to relocate to Miami. And well, Donna clearly told her daughter she would never give up and never stop fighting to ensure that Wendy and the boys would be relocated to Miami. She never did, okay? I also want to tell you guys that once Dan Markel died, you know what that daughter of hers did? This horrible human. She went and changed those boys' last names. The prosecutor goes on to say that one of the things that they're going to show in the trial is how close she was with her son. Keep in mind, again, her son is in jail. He was sentenced to 30 years. Specifically, that she would constantly vent and complain to Charlie about Wendy's situation in Tallahassee, that, you know, he was essentially violent. He was a crazy person. He was impossible to deal with and was causing her and her husband, Harvey, so Wendy's father, tremendous stress. And that the only person that they could rely on to solve this horrible situation was her son, Charlie. So essentially, she made it her son's problem to solve. And although the divorce between both Wendy and Dan was final before the murder, throughout that year, though, the litigation kept going because they had to continuously deal with the constant violations of custody agreements, violations of settlement agreements. All of these violations and them going back and forth in court happened up to Dan Markel's death. Now, a few months before his death, Dan Markel alleged in court documents that Donna Adelson was trying to alienate him from his children, and he didn't even want the kids around her, specifically stating that she was calling him stupid in front of the boys and telling the boys that their father was constantly trying to take them away from her. He asked the court to then prevent Donna Adelson from having unsupervised contact with her grandchildren. And guess what? That motion was still pending in court when he died. Now, I actually learned this in the book that Dan Markel's mom wrote, but they talk about this also in the opening statements. Within 48 hours of Dan Markel's death, Wendy emptied her home and moved those kids to Miami without telling Dan Markel's family. They were visiting from Canada. They were there, of course, for the events that take place prior to the burial, etc. And she had asked to spend time with the kids, okay? She withheld from that grandmother that she was never going to be able to see those kids because she was going to move them to Miami. When they arrived to Miami, they moved in with Donna, and within days, they were already enrolled in a school in Miami down the street. And again, like I mentioned, she removed the last names. It was as if that man never existed. Okay. Now, they continue to talk about the fact that Donna ran the dentist practice where her husband and her son were dentists. They owned the multiple practices. I believe they had multiple locations. She handled all of the accounting. She essentially not only ran the business, but she also ran their personal lives. Now, when Dan Markel dies, Wendy is brought in to the police station. Rightfully so. They're, asking questions. And the first thing that they do is to confirm, where was she? She said, you know what? I was, at home. I was having my TV fixed at the time that all this happened. So then they ask her, well, do you know anyone who would have motive to take your ex-husband's life? She goes, well, she even acknowledged that the family had motive to want him dead and that her parents had more reason to dislike Dan Markel than anyone else. Who says this in a police interview? She calls the mom in front of police and has him on speaker, and she says, hey, he's died, etc., or he's in the hospital, he's been shot. And when she hangs up, she looks at police and she goes, well, they acted surprised, so that's a relief. At this point, they ask, anyone else could have heard him. She tells police about her brother, and that her brother, Charlie, joked previously that he looked into hiring a hitman to take the life of her husband, but that buying her a TV was just cheaper. The same TV that Charlie Adelson bought his sister as a divorce gift was the same one that supposedly was being fixed, that TV repair. Now, at this point, police are investigating that Prius, and they stated that when they started retracing the steps of Dan Markel the morning of his murder, they discovered that that particular Prius had been in the gym parking lot waiting for over an hour for Dan to come out, and then they followed him home. Again, there's surveillance images showing including SunPass cameras, helping figure out exactly which car was the one that was utilized to take the life of Dan Markel. Now, it took them over a year, but they finally, found essentially the needle in the haystack, which is those two men. They had come from Miami. They were friends, and they had driven from Miami all the way to Tallahassee. The names are Luis Rivera, which is a longtime friend of Sigfredo Garcia. Now, what do those men have in common with the Adelson family? Well, one of them is the ex of Charlie Adelson's girlfriend. Okay, that's right. And the other one was a good friend. And according to Catherine, who is the one that's serving time, Charlie stated, hey, do you know anyone that can handle the problem? So she calls her baby daddy. Baby daddy calls a friend, calls it a day. And they go down to Miami to take the life of Dan Markel. Essentially drove up to Dan Markel's home, and the person got out of the car, shot Dan Markel while he was in the car. Now, when they start investigating, they realized that that car was driven from Miami to Tallahassee. They got him in the SunPass camera. They had him at the ATM. And they then started looking at phone records and realized that 10 minutes before this happened, these two people turned off their phones. Who are they? Where their names are Luis Rivera and Sigfredo Garcia. They then start looking into their financial statements, and they realize, hold up a minute, they seem to have received large deposits and they spent them. Now, what they also did was look at their phone records, and they realized that there is one person that they're constantly speaking to all of the time. Her name is Catherine. I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but she goes by Katie. As they continue to look at the phone records, they realize that Charlie Adelson, her son, and Katie had frequent contact as well. And well, what was the connection between them, or Charlie Adelson, Katie, and these two men? Well, one of the men was Katie's father of her children. Now, as I mentioned, the two men spent money, but so did she. In fact, when they start looking at the different bank statements, they realize that both Rivera and Garcia both bought motorcycles and cars. And then Katie ended up getting a breast augmentation surgery and later received a black Lexus, which what was interesting about that is that the previous owner was Charlie Adelson's father of that Lexus. Now, they went ahead and analyzed Catherine's accounts, and well, they didn't find any type of, checks showing how she paid the Lexus or even how she actually paid for her breast augmentation. But what they did find was cash deposits around the time of the murder. She deposited more money in her account in the 5 weeks after the murder than in the entire year before Dan Markel had died. But where's that money coming from? I mean, does Catherine have a job? No, she doesn't. She did not have a job. There was nothing tying her to her being employed anywhere except 2 months after Dan Markel dies. All of a sudden, she's added to the payroll at Adelson's family dentist practice. That's right. The mom, who is the one that runs all the accounts, all the deposits, payroll, all of that, she added Charlie Adelson's girlfriend at the time to their payroll. And mind you, there is zero proof that she actually did any work for the Adelsons. Nothing, not a zilch, except the fact that 44 checks were written to her. She was paid every 2 weeks over the course of 2 years after the murder. And they were all signed by Donna Adelson. Then they started looking at the phone calls and realized that Donna would call Charlie, Charlie would call Katie, Katie would then call her baby daddy, and it continued. It was like that prior to everything happening. And again, they continued to investigate, and they went ahead and hired, or they found someone, not found someone, it was an FBI undercover agent who essentially went up to her and was like, hey, I heard you're taking care of so-and-so in prison. I need you to take care of my people too. Instead of her being like, somebody's trying to extort me, she calls Charlie and is like, Charlie, help. What am I going to do about this? They want money. That's right. And that's how we landed into this trial. Let's get into the defendant's opening statement, or defense team. So the defense team opens up with the fact that you just heard over an hour, a cute little story. That's exactly what he said. Very old school is what he said. And he stated that while you heard all of this and this motive to take Dan Markel's life and all this money and all of that, not a single piece of evidence discussed shows that Donna Adelson planned it, hired, or intended that this to happen. And to please keep in mind that when the judge read over the instructions, they pretty much stated that the state has to prove motive. And the fact that without motive, how is the evidence going to show that Donna Adelson in fact did all of this? Now, what was insane to me was that the defense acted like they knew Dan, called him by the name that only family members and friends would call, which is Danny. He said, while we're here for the next couple of weeks and we're looking at all these text messages and all this supposed evidence, I don't want you to forget Danny. Danny was an amazing professor, very well educated, had 2 degrees, I think from Harvard, that's what he said, or from a law school there. He was a professor, had students, he traveled all over the places, all over the world to talk at conferences. They wanted him there because he was intelligent and, he spoke in a very eloquent way. He then addresses the fact that he's calling him Danny because most likely everyone in the trial, friends and family, are going to refer to him as Danny. So he's not trying to be informal. He's not trying to be inappropriate, but he wants to ensure that they know who they were talking about. He did say, look, yes, it's true. Her daughter married Dan Markel and they went through a horrible divorce. It was in 2012. They squabbled. They argued. That's what happens during a divorce. It is not friendly. However, in 2014, the divorce was already over. The relocation opportunity discussion didn't even really happen, and it had ended already on a final judgment before Dan Markel's death. And he said, look, that happens. Sometimes parents want to relocate the kids to be closer to family. Hey, they denied it. She went on. She never brought it up again. It wasn't a constant discussion. They had 50-50 custody. He was a great dad. He wanted to spend time. He FaceTimed with his kids. He talked to them. He was extremely involved in their lives. He brings up the fact that this man was brutally taken from his sons and that, Donna Adelson was extremely involved in having, FaceTimes arranged so that they could speak with the dad. If they were there visiting Wendy, they always were like, hey, let's make sure you FaceTime your dad before you go to bed. As if she was the one that, was also excited to have him participate in the life of the children. Mind you, the emails don't show that. He then goes on to talk about Donna and the fact that, yes, her husband had a business and their entire life. She ran the books. She ran, the entire business because when they started off, it was very small. He says that people that know Donna know that she is not like the state is portraying her to be. She's kind, loving. She cares more about people than she does herself. His opinion is that all of the evidence will show that someone did take him. And the people that took him were the 2 men that were arrested. And they were the ones that followed him to the school where he dropped off his kids. They followed him to the gym and then followed him home. He then brings up Charlie's ex-girlfriend and says, look, she was the one that essentially dealt with this. She was the one that reached out to the father. In fact, they talk about the fact that his buddy was recruited, which is true. They talk about that when they went down to Tallahassee, the buddy had no idea that they were there to murder anyone. They just thought that they were going to follow him around to see what his daily routine was. Now, what I noticed here is that this attorney is trying to throw her son under the bus. Keep in mind that he has always said he had nothing to do with it. He felt like he was being blackmailed, whatever. But at the end of the day, Katie, the ex-girlfriend, was the one that was always paying them. And that, yes, Charlie Adelson kept all his money stapled. I believe he stapled hundreds and piles of 1,000. And that every time Donna Adelson paid whatever he had to pay Charlie, for him being a dentist, he was the one that paid Katie the entire time. And that the state has already proved multiple times that he was the one that hired him, that he was the one that paid Katie, and that Katie gave them the money, but that nothing ties them to Donna. The fact that they are throwing her son under the bus is insane to me, but I guess that's a defense tactic. He says it's been 11 years now, 11 years of them blaming everyone and that they've already prosecuted and are in jail the people that did this, yet they continue to add Donna when there is zero evidence proving that Donna had anything to do with this. And he says, look, just pay attention to the evidence that they're going to present and you will see that there is nothing showing that she did all of this. This is the state's first witness. This is James Geiger, and he has actually testified in every single one of these cases. This is the neighbor that called 911. Now, he shares that on July 18th, 14th of 2014, around 10:30 a.m. He and his wife are in the living room. They're on their iPads, and they all of a sudden hear a loud bang and a popping noise. So they get up and they have a huge bay window. They start looking to the right and then to the left. And this is actually shows the home. So to the right, you're looking at their home, and to the left, you're looking at Dan Markel's house. He states that when they're looking, they all of a sudden see a car rapidly reversing out of Danny's driveway. He states that in the peripheral, he could see that it was either light silver or a white colored Prius speeding out of the driveway. And they asked him, well, what caught your attention? Why was that kind of, something that you noticed? And he said, well, because in the previous weeks, there had been multiple burglaries. And so the thought process was they must have been trying to break in to Dan's house. So he then goes out of his home and walks over to Dan's house. He says, I walked over just to look to see if any damage had been done to his door, anything like that. As he's approaching the house, that is when he realizes that the garage door was open, that Dan Markel's car was inside the garage, and the motor was running. He said, at that point, I was like, well, I guess it wasn't a burglary because clearly Dan is in the home. He said he turned around and walked back to his house. He goes, I can't tell you why, but I just stood at my front window and looked out and waited a few minutes, maybe 3 or 4, and something just didn't seem right. Danny had not backed out. At this point, he should have backed out to the driveway. So he told his wife, I think something is wrong. I'm going to walk over there. And he goes, and I did that. When he walked over there, again, notices the garage door was still open. The car was still running. He said, well, then let me go ahead and walk into the garage and see if, what's going on. He says he walks into the garage and he sees the driver's, someone is in the driver's seat. He said, he's probably on his cell phone talking, but he wanted to make sure everything was okay. So at this point, that is when he sees that when he's walking towards that driver's side window, that he stepped on glass. And that is when he realized that the window had been shattered. He looked inside and saw a bloody head. The head was slowly moving back and forth, and he hollered immediately, Danny, what happened? Danny, what happened? He didn't get a response other than the head was rolling. At that point, he knew that he had to call 911. He pulled his cell phone out, and he says that when he went into his pocket, that's normally where he keeps his cell phone. He realized he didn't have his cell phone. He runs back to the house, calls 911. They ask him, how many minutes do you think elapsed between the time that you saw the Prius walking out and and the time that you were able to reach 911? He said about less than 10 minutes and more than 5 minutes is what I would say. They at this point go over the multiple pictures. They showed him this picture and they asked him, is this what the driveway looked like? The garage door was open. He goes, yes, that's exactly how I remember it. He goes, now in this picture, the doors are actually open. But when you went over there, were the doors actually open? And he goes, no, they were all closed when I walked over there. The only thing that was damaged was the driver's side window. It's the only thing that I saw, and that, yes, it was completely shattered. Now, they then show him this vehicle and they ask him, is this kind of the color that the vehicle that you saw? He goes, yes, I remember it being either light colored silver or white, but this is the car, it was a Toyota Prius. So then they asked him, how well did you know Dan Markel? He said that, in 2014, they had moved about 5 years prior to that into that home. He said, they were newlyweds. They had moved in next door. We weren't close, but we'd see them occasionally. He said, the most memorable thing any other neighbors would tell you is that when they first moved in, they had a housewarming party and they invited everyone in the neighborhood, and they did attend. That was the first time that they saw them and visited them. They seemed like a nice young couple. He said, but we weren't close. Now at the beginning when they moved, they did, of course, didn't have any kids because they were newlyweds, but after a few years, they had a first child and then a second child. He goes, okay, well, at the time that Dan Markel was shot, had Wendy already moved out? He goes, yes, from what we understood, they were already going through a divorce. After that, we rarely saw Danny, and I don't think we ever saw the children. They asked him, did you know his profession? He goes, yeah, I knew that he was an attorney. I know they both were, and I know that he had to do with FSU Law School, but we didn't know exactly what he did at FSU. So at this point, they do go over the 911 call. He states that in the call, he heard a loud bang, car pulled away from next door. He went over and looked in. The garage door was up and thought the gentleman was backing out. Went back to his house, noticed the gentleman did not back out. And at this point, he went back over. That is when he discovered that the window was shattered. He's inside. I don't know if somebody tried to shoot him or if he shot himself. And then at this point, they provided the address to make sure the ambulance came. Now, the next witness is retired Sergeant David Sims from the Tallahassee Police Department. He stated that on July 18th of 2014, he was not dispatched, but he was actually at the station working on paperwork when he heard the call to go out. So at this point, he responded. He said he was the first one on the scene. He made contact immediately with the neighbor, and the neighbor indicated something was going on in the garage next door to his residence. He thought the neighbor was in there, and, he all of a sudden heard a large noise. There was broken glass in the car. At this point, he observed the vehicle. He says he walks up to the driver's window and he did say, look, the neighbor let me know that the name of the neighbors was Dan Markel. And so at this point, he, kind of spoke to him. He said, Daniel, he didn't get any response. He got a little closer and found that the driver's side window was broken kind of at an angle. There was a small rounded spot in the glass that was still there. He said, Daniel, again, no response. He was slumped over and kind of gasping for air. He noticed that his set of eyeglasses, half of them were laying in his lap. He had a cell phone in his left hand. He had a business card in his right hand. He said he walks around the other side of the car. He reaches in and unlocks the door. At this point, he shuts off the car because the car at that point was still running. They did notice that the other half of his glasses were laying on the floorboard. So, of course, they start taking multiple pictures and they start showing them kind of the pictures, what the car looked like, the fact that he was able to reach in and unlock the door because at this point the door was closed, so they had to unlock it. He said that when he got there, they were still waiting for EMT to arrive. So what he did is that he pulled out a gym bag that was in there. And that way, he set it on the ground to make a better entry into the vehicle to take him out. They let him know that he never, they shared that he never regained consciousness while he was there. Now, once EMT arrived, at this point, they had multiple officers go into the home. So they checked out the vehicle. They then go into the home and they asked him, was there any indication of a burglary? Any obvious signs of a struggle? Nope, not at all. Now let's get into the next witnesses. This is Craig Ism, and according to his witness statement, he was a part of the Tallahassee Police Department for 28 and a half years. He's actually already retired. Keep in mind, this happened back in 2014. Now, he was assigned to the murder of Dan Markel. He shares that Dan lived about 11 hours after he was shot. He asked, were the people closest to the victim interviewed? He says yes, including his ex-wife, Wendy Adelson. They approached Wendy at a restaurant in Tallahassee on Market Street. They did that on the day that all of this happened, actually July 18th of 2014, about 3.5 hours after the shooting. He said that when they approached her, they told her they needed to talk to her in private. She was having lunch with 2 ladies, so it was 3 people in total at the table. They immediately identified himself as a police officer. They let her know that she was not in any trouble, but that they needed her to step away the table and discuss something that happened with her ex-husband and that the children were not involved. They let her know that the children were in fact being checked on. They were still at the daycare and they were still fine. They asked him, did you put any handcuffs on her? Did you read any Miranda rights? He was, no, not at all. At the time, she was not a suspect. We were just having conversations with her, and she was interviewed multiple times. They then shared that they kind of discussed the victim's relationship with Wendy Adelson, so that they were going through and were still fighting in a contentious divorce, showing that there was a child custody battle. In fact, they pulled up the filings of the divorce case between Wendy and Dan. The divorce essentially, while it was finalized, they continue to have those child custody issues and going back to court. Now, at this point, they are done with him. They ask him to step down, and the judge is actually quite upset and says specifically that at this point, he just wants to send the jurors home because they're wasting time litigating over things that should have been handled out of court. So keep in mind that Georgia Kaplan, the prosecution from the state of Florida, they've been prepared to go to trial. She had to get new lawyers a while back, but now all of a sudden, now every time she talks about something, they want to argue and keep out of evidence. In fact, they just objected to her even talking about the child custody case with the police officer that was just speaking, but of course, the judge allowed it. Now, they also wanted to keep out specific communications because they don't feel the foundation has been laid. There's nothing directly implying that with these emails, Donna Adelson had anything to do with his death. So at this point, the judge is like, we're going to go over everything. I don't care if we stay here as late as, we need to, but we're not going to continue wasting the juror's time because you want to go over every single piece of the exhibit. So at this point, they bring the witness back, and he is going over an email that was forwarded to Donna Adelson from Wendy. And the original email was from Dan Markel, and that is where they're discussing the motion where he is requesting that Donna Adelson not have unsupervised visitation with his children. And guess what the defense do? They object. And at this point, the judge says, "Can you please just step down, sir?" At this point, Donna Adelson's defense team is like, there's no proof that it was Donna in the emails because Donna and her husband share an email. Now we're throwing the man under the bus. Oh my goodness. So at this point, the judge was like, pretty much went over different motions, declined half of them, and then brought back the witness. So at this point, they go over again the email. He said, they asked him, did you review a motion where Dan Markel was seeking to restrict Donna Adelson's access to the children? He goes, yes, I did. And yes, it was pending at the time of his death. Did you find any emails in evidence that the contents of the motions that were sent to Donna Adelson? He goes, yes. He states that in these motions, he does not want Donna Adelson to have any unsupervised content or contact with the children because of the statements that are made in the court filing, pretty much that the children reflected that grandma says you're stupid, grandma says she hates you, and even the fact that she was taking them from the grandparents. So at this point, they're going over the emails and all of the name calling that Donna does in reference to Dan Markel. They continue and they pull up the court filing where the relocation was then denied. They ask him, does Dana Adelson try to propose another plan to facilitate the relocation in light of the court's ruling? He goes, yes. Relocation is still being discussed even though it was declined. She actually suggests that the children start attending a Christian or a Catholic church to take pictures and to send it to Dan Markel to strong arm him into relocating to Miami. So essentially they wanted to coerce him. They then talk about bribing him, offering him $1 million where they each would give $333,000 to get him to relocate. They then start going over the life insurance. So they said that there was a life insurance policy. One of them was for $2 million. The second one was $60,000 through the law school, FSU. Were there any survivor benefits? Yes. In fact, Wendy gets approximately $4,800 a month for the children. He also had a pension, deferred comp, and 401k, which valued about $300,000. And Dan Markel's estate was valued at $2.7 million. They said, did you attempt to establish a timeline of the victim's activities prior to his murder? They said, yes, at 8:50 in the morning, he dropped them off at the preschool, then went to the gym. And when they looked at the surveillance, that's when they showed that essentially he was being followed and the Prius was in the parking lot. Now, they did say that he dropped off the kids at 8:50, arrives at the gym at 9:11, and they see his car entering, but then they see another vehicle enter, that is the Prius that they're referring to. No one gets out of the car. They're just sitting there until Dan Markel leaves the gym. At this point, they then have surveillance of Dan Markel leaving the gym and that Prius following them. They were then able to kind of, through surveillance, through the different areas show the cars kind of following him. And then also they were able to find a bus video from before and after the shooting where it shows the suspects in the vehicle. And again, they continued kind of doing a flyover, which shows, again, evidence of the vehicles moving through. Now I'm referring to a city bus. So they utilize the cameras on top of the city bus to kind of be able to track the cars. They then state that after, so he essentially was killed between 10:51 a.m. and 11:02, but then at 11:02, that's when the 911 came on. The call was received. They narrowed it down because they utilize the same city bus group through a different route. And that is when they catch the vehicles turning and kind of following each other through all the way up to 10:51. At this point, they then stated, look, they kind of went back to the city buses to try and see if they can continue seeing what direction the Prius went after the shooting of Dan Markel. They now go on to the hitman. They state that they were looking at phone records, and that's kind of when things didn't make sense. They start sorting and realize that Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera were the subjects that were in the Prius that they had video were following Dan Markel. Dan Markel dropped his kids off July 18th of 2014 in the morning at daycare. Guess who followed him to the daycare? That Prius. Then after that, he went to the gym. That Prius was there and parked until he came out. Then they followed him home where they took his life. Now, at this point, they start talking over the two separate numbers, the fact that there was a rental contract on the Prius. So the rental contract on the Prius shows that both Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera were on the contract. And that the car was driven all the way from Miami. So they continue looking at phone records and they find that one of them was consistently communicating with Catherine McManaba, I think is how you pronounce her last name. Catherine was the mother of Sigfredo Garcia's children. And the thing is that Catherine was also the girlfriend of her son, Charlie Adelson, who was serving a 30-year sentence for his involvement in this. Okay, so at this point, they initially started kind of connecting everything and realizing that their phone records showed that Catherine was consistently communicating with Sigfredo Garcia, and the connection was with Charlie Adelson. Now, at the time of the murder where Dan died, she was working at some dental office somewhere. However, post-murder, she started receiving compensation from the Adelson Institute. Keep in mind, Donna Adelson is the one that writes the checks. She is the one that manages everything. She's the office manager. She manages budgets, payroll, all of it. She received, compensation from them every 2 weeks, just like an employee. When they start looking, that's when they discover, the Adelson Institute, that's owned by Harvey and Charlie Adelson. And both of them, I believe, were dentists, but Charlie is actually a periodontist. Okay. And then at this point, they go over the fact that Donna Adelson, again, was the one that kept the books. She was the one that managed all of the employment records. And they attempted to secure employment records verifying her employment. So then the FBI got involved. They got a subpoena, and the attorney representing the dental office, all they did was provide them checks from the Adelson Institute to Catherine, and no W-2, no responsibility showing what was her day-to-day job there at all. In fact, there was nothing showing what the regular hours were, that she was there during regular hours. The fact that they had no visibility, no surveillance showing that she was actually going into the building every day to work, and the employees didn't even know who she was or what she did while she was there. Now, according to the checks, it shows that Catherine was paid as of September of 2014. Keep in mind, Dan Markel was murdered July of 2014. They then showed the paychecks showing that she was paid all the way through May of 2016. And it starts a few months just after the homicide. So while the homicide happened July 18th, that first check that she received as an imaginary employee was September 18th. They then reviewed the checks and saw that all the checks were signed by Donna Adelson. Again, there was no way, no evidence showing that she worked there at all, showing that she provided any type of service on-site or off-site the business. Nothing to show that she ever had any contact with the patients. They even tried to listen to calls. Nothing, nada, zilch, showing she had any involvement with that dentist office. Now, the defense team starts questioning this investigator, asking him how long he did this for. He did 25 years. And he shared, at this point, that means you have to be extremely thorough. And he said, yes, of course. And he said, okay, well, let's talk about that. You want to make sure you don't leave any stone unturned. Did you get cellular phone records of the Adelson family early on? He said, yes, we got them in July. Wendy Adelson's parents and Wendy, when they arrived in Miami, essentially that's kind of when they got those phone records. They then start looking at Sefredo Garcia and Luis Rivera, and they made the connection with Catherine. He says, correct. We then made the connection with Charlie Adelson. They saw that large cash deposits were done by Katie. Keep in mind that she was in unemployment status, still paying her bills in South Florida. They were like, yes, that's correct. We already made a connection stating that. And then over the next couple of years, still showing that, she was still getting paid. The defense team starts asking about, Mr. Markel's life insurance. Well, you're not a family attorney. You're an investigator. So is there any proof showing that Donna Adelson benefited at all from anything in relation to Danny's life insurance, pension, anything like that? He goes, nope, not at all. Not anything I can tell. They said, you also talked about her dressing up the kids and taking pictures in front of the Catholic Church. Did Wendy take those suggestions? He said, no. He goes, okay, well, let's talk about the Adelson Institute. It's small. It's a handful of employees. Do you know whether they have employee job descriptions? He goes, no, I don't. I don't understand. I also don't know if they have employee reviews, etc. He goes, so I would think that type of business, working with people back and forth, that there would be little scrutiny involved. So maybe they don't keep records of their employees nor their job descriptions. And then when she got arrested, you testified that you received a call from someone who identified themselves as Charlie's attorney. He goes, yes, that's correct. He goes, but it was Charlie's attorney, nothing in relation with Donna Adelson. Correct. They then go over the emails and pretty much show that Donna and her husband essentially had the same email address. So pretty much saying, okay, these emails that are stating this, that, and the other about Dan, do you have proof that it is in fact Dana Adelson? Because it says here the email is donnaharvey@gmail.com. And he said, okay, well, whose name is it? Did you get anything specifically from either of them? He said, yes, one email from Harvey Adelson, where he signed it, Love Dad. July 18th, between 8 and 12, it was a repair for the TV. Keep in mind that was her excuse, Wendy's, as to when the murder happened. She wasn't there. And it was an email from the Geek Squad from Best Buy that was set up. So he said, okay, again, that was Harvey Adelson, not Donna Adelson, correct. And they do go over the fact that some of the emails are either from Harvey or Donna or sometimes mom and dad. And that's kind of what they reiterated is there's nothing showing that it's just Donna, just Harvey. And sometimes both of them would email Wendy. And he said, yep, that's true. That was the end of his testimony. The final witness of day one, which is one of the hitmen, Luis Rivera. Luis Rivera is immediately asked by the prosecution team where he's from. He's from Puerto Rico, but he pretty much lived his entire life in Miami. Now, they start asking him, have you ever been convicted of a felony? He says, yes, I have 5 felonies. So he has a federal sentence in this particular state case. She asked him, what did you plead for this particular case? He said, I actually pled guilty to second-degree murder. His sentence was 19 years, and it was concurrent with his federal sentence. And so they asked him, what did you do to get, that 19-year sentence? And he said, well, I cooperated. So at this point, he said, has anyone ever told you anything other than to tell the truth? He says, no, ma'am. Has anyone ever offered you anything other than that sentence? He said, nope, not at all. I haven't been offered a deal, none of that. That was the sentence that he received. Now let's get into the details. She shares, she asked, were you hired to participate in the murder of Dan Markel? He said, yes, ma'am. Who hired you to be involved in the murder? My friend, Dudu Garcia. Dudo. Garcia. But his name is Sigfredo Garcia. They're childhood friends. He essentially considers him one of his best friends, or at least, considered him one of his best friends because he turned on him once he accepted the deal. Now, who enlisted Sigfredo Garcia to be part of the murder? He said, Katie. Who's Katie? Well, Katie was his wife. Keep in mind that Katie, again, was the girlfriend of Charlie Adelson, Donna Adelson's son. And the theory of the state is that she would vent to Charlie, and Charlie got to a point where he was like, I need someone to handle my ex-brother-in-law so that my sister can move here, and essentially my mom can leave us the hell alone. So they asked him, what exactly does that mean? And he said, well, we were enlisted to be involved in the murder. He said, did you know that somebody was paying Katie? He goes, yes. And what was the purpose of the murder as you understood it? Well, what we understood is that Wendy Adelson wanted her kids. And did you understand that you were killing the father of the kids so that Wendy could have the kids? Yes, ma'am. And so she said, have you ever previously referred to a dentist being involved? Yes, ma'am. Who was the dentist? Charlie. Again, Charlie is her son. And at the time was Katie's boyfriend. I don't understand how Sigfredo Garcia was like, yes, let me help my ex with her new boyfriend situation. Okay, anyways. So they asked him, did you ever have any contact with the dentist? Not at all. We knew that Katie, though, was dating the dentist. And so what did the dentist have to do with the lady in Tallahassee who needed her kids? He said, I don't know nothing about them. I don't know nothing about that family. All I know is that we were paid $35,000, or at least Katie told them that they were paid $35,000. He doesn't know what was the total amount, but he knows what his part was. Do you know how much Katie got? He said no. I think the total between all of us was about $100,000, and it was a one-time payment. So they asked him, did you have any information on the man that you guys, were going to murder? And he said no. All that we had was a piece of paper with his picture on his face and his address, exactly where he lived. Then they go on to continue the fact that, how many times did you go to Tallahassee in relation to this case? He goes, twice. Were you with Garcia both times? And he said yes. We went one time in June, and then the last time was in July. That is when the murder essentially happened. They then go in to talk about the June trip. They rented a car for the June trip. It was a rental car that they brought up in Miami. He said, did you remember taking both trips to Tallahassee, like the exact same route? He said, I don't remember. Did you have the picture of Dan Markel on both trips? He said, yes. We drove out here. We just followed him around to see where he lived. He said, did you have a gun on the first trip? Yes. And was that gun specifically to take his life? Yes. He was the one that actually bought the gun. Now on June, they actually went by his residence and actually laid eyes on him. They passed by his house. They scoped out the place and followed him around to the daycare. And then home, they stated that they stayed about a couple of days in June. So at this point, she asked, why didn't it happen on that trip? He goes, for whatever reason, it didn't happen on the trip. I think we lost them. And she said, did you get angry? He goes, no, I don't really think so. We knew that we had to then go back to finish the job if we wanted to get the money. And that's when they rented the Prius. At this point, when they rented the Prius, they provided the cell phone numbers. They provided address of their homes. And they did talk about the fact that they stayed a couple nights in a hotel room. They, I believe, just brought one gun. And they said that when they were driving, they would put the gun out and just kind of shoot into the floorboard of the Prius. He said, why? He was like, no, I don't remember why. He was just messing around the other guy with some gun and fired it into the car. Did it disable the car? He goes, the car started stopping little by little. It started slowing down. And then at this point, they took it to the auto place to get a piece of the hose back together to make sure the car then would be fixed. She then asked, when you go back in July, did you follow him to daycare, etc.? He goes, yes, we followed him to the daycare. We saw him drop off his children. They followed him to the gym. He went inside and worked out. Now, they made it clear that the reason being that they had to ensure it happened on that day was because they were told by Katie that he was actually going to go out of town. And so they needed to make sure that he got murdered before he went out of town. He said that Sigfredo Garcia was the one that jumped out of the car, went up to the vehicle and shot him. He said, did you not want to be the shooter? He goes, no, and I already knew that he was essentially was going to be the person that was going to shoot Dan Markel. He then said they got rid of the gun, they went back, and that on the drive back, he hears Sigfredo call Katie and to confirm what had happened, like, okay, we're good, and now we're going to get the money. Now, normally, she would only talk to her ex, Sigfredo Garcia, but at one point that Saturday morning, so the following day, she calls him to find out exactly where he's at to be able to give him the money. So at this point, they were like, okay, is that normal? She goes, not really. I mean, she never calls my phone, but at this point she did it because apparently she was trying to get a hold of also for Sigfredo Garcia. Did you get your money? Yes. At that point, they got the money. And when they got it, it was in a barber shop. And when they pulled up to the house, Katie and Garcia called the phone and went ahead and provided him the money. It was in a package and it was 10 all hundreds, and every thousand was stapled. And that is exactly how her son, Charlie Adelson, keeps his money in the safe. At this point, when they had their money, they went ahead and spent it. And they even asked him, would you have preferred just to rob this man to get the money? He goes, absolutely. I even brought it up to Sigfredo Garcia because I didn't know that we were going to go and kill this man, essentially. I thought initially we were following him first. Defense team made it clear that he didn't know Donna Adelson. And well, you know, why would she be involved if he didn't even know her? Well, that is the end of day one. Talk to you soon.